I use speed ramping probably more than I'd like to admit. It's a really easy transition to learn. And today I just want to make a video talking about speed ramping in general and just a couple quick tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. Speed ramping is actually used a lot more than people realize. I enjoy it a lot because it's a really simple way to spice up edits without becoming too gimmicky, too trendy. There's a lot of natural and authentic ways that you can incorporate it into your shots. My favorite way to use it is to change your environment, change your scene from one location to another, or from one character, one talent to another. Now, this is just a quick short video I wanted to make on speed ramping in general. And before I get into like the editing techniques, let's talk about how to go about shooting speed ramps. Crucially, the scenes that you choose for speed ramping can make a big difference when you're looking at the final output. What I mean by that is you can speed ramp just about anything, but for me, the best scenes to speed ramp are super smooth, long, extended cuts of movement. My favorite scenes are gimbal shots. You can use any gimbal. My favorite gimbal to use is the DJI RS gimbal. Typically, I use the RS3 Pro, I think, but in the past, I've used the RS2, the usual RS. Any sort of gimbal or stabilizer works for whatever camera that you have. You can do speed ramping with sort of mobile phone gimbals. I've used the Insta360 Flow before on my iPhone, works great. And I would say some key things when you're thinking about shooting scenes, specifically with speed ramping in mind, is that you keep a very constant, steady motion, either the motion that the talent is doing, for instance, if they're walking in and out of the frame, or the motion that you do typically. Typically, when I'm doing speed ramping, I initiate the motion or I continue the motion around the talent, or perhaps towards the talent, maybe front and back on a vertical plane. One movement I like is when you walk backwards and your talent moves forwards. I've done this in the dolly ramp transition tutorial. Another movement that I use all the time is the rotational movement. So that's simply where you have your talent or whoever your model just kind of standing central. And as you're rotating around them, you try to keep them as centered as possible. Usually I like to do this in sort of like a half moon or a half crescent movement where it's not a full circle, but I like to shoot from one side and rotate all the way around the other. And the other movements I like to do all the time are just keep my model central and just either walk backwards or walk forwards and keep them, again, centered as much as possible. Now, besides the movements, specifically with your camera gear, again, you can use any cameras to speed ramp. You can even do speed ramping handheld. When you don't have a gimbal, that's not a big deal. You can go ahead and do whip pans and marry speed ramps with whip pans to create that motion. As long as there's like an in and out point of motion in your mind, then you can kind of cut between speed ramps and whip pans and marry that motion together in various transitions. It's super easy. Another thing I like to note in the shooting phase are your actual camera settings. Now, you can do speed ramping on any FPS, obviously, but my favorite camera settings are typically 60 frames per second, not 120. It's a little bit too much. I don't need that much of a slow motion. But when I shoot 60 FPS, especially when you're doing speed ramping and when you're doing stabilization in post, having a higher FPS allows for more frames, obviously, and that gives your software, if you're doing sort of like stabilization in post, more room to sort of play with your video. Also, if you have a lot of motion blur in your actual clips, then sometimes speed ramping gets a little bit too blurry in my experience. So my sweet spot is either, if I'm not shooting normally, I'm typically shooting in 60 FPS, and that gives me ability, obviously, if you're shooting in 24 or 30 FPS timelines, then you can slow down your footage by 50% and it's super smooth. So yeah, when I shoot with speed ramps in mind, I typically like 60 FPS. That's sort of like my sweet spot. Now, quickly, I wanted to go over kind of the base settings and the base technique that I use for literally every speed ramp that I ever do. And the technique is almost unchanged for anything. And I just wanted to touch on a few key points that helped me when I sort of learned what my flow is for speed ramping, and this might help you. Now, this is actually a sequence that is shown in the very beginning of this video, and it's a sequence that I used in a recent AAPE campaign for the subsidiary company under Vape. This was essentially, let me just play it through. And let me just show you the two clips on their own without any sort of speed adjustments here. So let's watch the first clip here. I didn't shoot these particular two clips, Peace did. I was just working on directing, but if you watch the movement of the camera, he had this on, I believe it was FPV mode or 360 roll feature. A lot of the features on the recent RS2, RS3, RS4, the gimbals from DJI have an FPV mode or a 360 roll feature. This is how you achieve this sort of smooth 360 consistent effect. All you have to do is like hold down the joystick to either the left or right and it'll roll for you. Super cool feature, but that's a feature that he used for these two raw clips, or this one raw clip actually. So that's the feature he used for this clip. And as you can tell, the key point I want to notice here is that it's just a consistent, for this, it doesn't have to be consistent obviously throughout the whole entire raw clip, but for the part that we're actually going to end up using, if you notice, it's just a nice consistent pace. A lot of times when I was first starting with speed ramping, I thought like, oh, okay, when I actually do the motion, I need to speed up that portion in the actual shooting phase. That you don't need to do, and it's a lot easier to go ahead and try and keep a consistent pace, a consistent rhythm throughout the entire movement portion, and then later just use that in the actual edit. You can speed ramp it or speed it up or speed it down as much as you would like in post-production. So this is, again, the first clip, and this, if you play the actual transition, we actually started at 50%, so it's a little bit slower, and then I ramped into this second clip, which, if you think about the motion, it doesn't actually connect. And that's a great thing about speed ramping, is that you don't necessarily, a lot of times speed ramping in the same general direction looks a lot smoother, but in my experience, you don't actually have to have the exact same motion between your two clips when you're speed ramp transitioning between the two. Again, this is a rotational one into a whip up. And this second shot was actually handheld, which goes into our second clip. If you just want to watch it real quickly in its entirety. This is piece, you can actually see his feet here, whipping up. And he actually did this a few different times. We do that all the time in our raw clips, but he whips up and then he slowly just pulls back. And he does it again here. This is a super cool shot just because you got the train in the back, which we were super lucky with. Now, to give you a breakdown of exactly how I went ahead and created the speed ramp, let me just start over. So the first thing in Premiere Pro specifically is you want to go ahead and go down to show clip keyframes and make sure that you're on speed. It'll change it to like a keyframeable clip. And then you're going to want to go ahead and go to the position that you want to start your speed ramp. To give you a little insight, I like to do speed ramping usually over just like 5 frames or 4 frames or 6 frames. Anything more than that, I feel it just doesn't feel super smooth. So the sweet spot I found is, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Maybe like 5 keyframes. I'll start my first keyframe. You can either add a keyframe, you can print command click, and it'll create a keyframe for you. Now, the second portion of this, you're gonna wanna click and drag and increase your speed. And this depends on like your speed of how quickly you actually shot your clip. Typically, I'll do like 1,000 to 2,000%. Something around there. Doesn't really matter. It just something around there usually looks quite nice. So I'll do 1,000%, and then the next thing you'll do is you can click and drag, and this will kind of like ease in your speed ramp. And so now if you notice, we'll have it, and I'll place my end keyframe 1 frame over. So I don't like to cut here. I like to cut it right before it actually hits that terminal velocity. That's a key point here. Your terminal velocity is the max speed of your clip once it hits your second keyframe. So terminal velocity, again, I like to do, I don't know, a base is like nice base is like 1,000%. So I'll place this 1 frame over right here, and then I'll cut my clip. And then if we play this through, it's even a little bit too slow. For this one in particular, I think I'm gonna drop it up to 3,000. 3,000 over, maybe 3,000 is too much. Okay, something is clearly off. And the thing that is off that really blends speed ramps together is the addition of motion blur. Now, Premiere Pro doesn't have native motion blur in it. I think After Effects, you can do force motion blur. In other programs, you can add motion blur. Premiere Pro, you can keyframe motion blur in Gaussian blur. Like I could go to effects and, or like, it's like, what is it? Directional blur or something. There's a couple different blurs that you can keyframe. You can like increase the blur over these frames right here. You want to show that there's some sort of motion blur right here. That really sells the effect. What I do, there's a plugin I talk about all the time. It's called Real Smart Motion Blur, not sponsored. This is just a great motion blur plugin that I use all the time. I'll pop this on an adjustment layer. So if I just show you real quickly, put RSMB Pro on this adjustment layer, and I'll just put the adjustment layer over the area that the actual motion occurs, right? Let's render this. Now let's play it through. Boom. That's pretty smooth. If you look at what RSMB actually does, like frame by frame, see that like nice motion blur around that circular motion? Boom. And that marries well with the natural motion blur in this 24 FPS clip, that piece shot, this whip up. You pair that with like some nice sound effects. riser, whoosh. Listen to it without the train. Not quite as nice, but now if you listen to it, that train sound really sells it. Sorry, we got a little off topic. Okay, let me show you one more example. I did a recent Babe job. In the edit, I had this. I had these speed ramps, and I just wanted to show you like a breakdown of the percentages of the speed ramps. So give you an idea, I went from 2000% for this one down to 100%, sped up to the next location, and this was back up to 3000%. And if you just look at it really closely, I went from 100% up to 3000% over 4 frames, back down to, was this 100%? Yeah, 100%. For another 4 frames, held it, and then over the next, this one is quite actually pretty long. This one was over like 8 frames. It went to the hand catch. So this one, just because I sped ramped it to like a handheld shot. These speed ramps are a little bit longer than usual. This was like over like 6, 7, 8 frames for both of these. They were just consistent though. And if you notice here though, I actually cut again before the keyframe actually shows up in your timeline. I do this all the time. If you extend these clips here, see how the keyframes, they go after my cuts, or before, after my cut here, before my cut here. I like to cut before the keyframe actually shows up. That's just something that's a little trick that I like to do. Shoot. Little speed ramp, change locations. This is a good example of like the shots don't even have to be exactly the same. They can just be generally the same, and the speed ramp usually works. Typically when you mention speed ramping nowadays, I think most people, what comes to mind are like the trendy car edits. I do think there's a tasteful way to incorporate speed ramping into both your professional client work, your personal work, specifically for socials. It's a nice trick to have, and it doesn't look too gimmicky. It's something you can use to transition between environments, between places, a bunch of different things. If you look back at my work, you'd be like, this guy really likes speed ramping, but I do. And I think it's really easy to use and incorporate in a very subtle and nonchalant way. If you have any questions, please leave in the comments below. Please like, subscribe. We hit 100K on this channel, which is a crazy achievement. I just want to say I really appreciate everybody watching these videos and supporting the channel and just joining me in this journey. Having this channel and this platform in particular, just to be able to talk about longer form stuff and just flesh out my thoughts has been a real privilege, a real pleasure. I really appreciate everybody joining me. Do we do the silver plaque unboxing video? I don't know. Should we? Thank you again, as always, and I'll see you guys in the next one.